Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute for Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. In a moment, we'll sit down with Dr. Stephen Nagy, professor at International Christian University in Tokyo and a visiting fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs to talk about Canada's role as an Indo-Pacific power. But first, here are the latest developments from the world of geoeconomics. U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo visited Beijing on August 29th. During her visit, China and the United States announced that they had agreed to hold regular discussions on commercial issues and export controls. According to Secretary Raimondo, one working group will include business leaders and will discuss commercial issues, and another will be a government-to-government exchange of information about U.S. enforcement of export controls. According to a Commerce Department official, the discussions will cover how regulations are enforced, but not how policy is made or which products are covered. Secretary Raimondo and her Chinese counterpart, Wang Wentao, further agreed to meet annually. Japan announced an emergency fund of 20.7 billion yen, or $141 million, on September 4th to assist exporters harmed by China's import ban on Japanese seafood. The new fund is in addition to 80 billion yen, or $547 million previously allocated to support Japanese fisheries and seafood processing facilities in anticipation of backlash against Japan's plans to discharge treated water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. These funds will be used to find new markets for Japanese seafood and to fund government purchases of seafood products. Mainland China is the biggest overseas market for Japanese seafood, accounting for 22.5% of Japan's total exports, but makes up a limited portion of Japan's overall trade with China. Chinese imports of Japanese seafood were down 68% in August. Italy is expected to leave China's Belt and Road Initiative at the end of this year when Italy's participation comes up for renewal. Italian Premier Giorgia Meloni has been opposed to the project since Italy first joined in 2019 and is expected to put BRI renewal up for a vote before Italy's parliament, where a conservative majority would endorse Meloni's plans to withdraw from BRI. During a meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang, Meloni emphasized her hope for continued strong economic relations with China, while neither country's statement following the meeting mentioned anything about BRI. The Australia-China high-level dialogue took place in early September following a 3-year pause resulting from Australian concerns about Chinese interference in its elections and Australia's decision to prohibit Chinese firms from participating in Australia's 5G network rollout. The dialogue includes senior representatives from industry, government, academia, and elsewhere to discuss trade and investment, as well as security issues. The meeting will be chaired by Australian Trade Minister Craig Emerson and Chinese Foreign Minister Li Zhaoxing. The United States and Vietnam elevated their relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership, the highest level in Vietnam's diplomacy that places the United States at the same level as countries like China and Russia. This occurred during U.S. President Joe Biden's trip to Vietnam on September 10th, where both countries also signed a Memorandum of Cooperation for Vietnam to receive funding from the International Technology Security and Innovation Fund, or ITSI, which was created under the CHIPS Act passed last year to provide $500 million to ensure a more diverse, resilient, and secure global semiconductor supply chain. The United States also set aside $2 million for training workers in the assembly, testing, and packaging of semiconductors in Vietnam. This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Stephen Nagy. He's professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan, and a visiting fellow with the Japanese Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Nagy, thanks for sitting down with us today.
Paul, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Today I'd like to talk about your home country, Canada. And more specifically, Canada's geoeconomic strategy and its role in a lot of these debates that are ongoing, not just in the region, but worldwide. So first question, does Canada have an international economic strategy?
Well, I think it's working on it. Last year, at the end of the year, they released something called the Canadian Indo-Pacific Strategy. It was meant to pivot some of Canada's resources, a significant amount of resources. They put forward 2.3 billion Canadian dollars towards the Indo-Pacific over 5 years. And this is apparently a down payment for a much longer term engagement. And they've looked at how Canada can engage in the Indo-Pacific, but also I think globally in terms of being an energy provider, being a critical mineral provider, helping contribute to norm building in terms of trade agreements like the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And why I think that's important, again, is geoeconomics includes your trade partners, it includes standard setting, it includes things like protecting intellectual property rights, which really are the basis for fueling research and development in the next economy. They've thought about engaging in the Indo-Pacific region, but agreements like the TPP really also include labor law, environmental law, and limiting the role of state-owned enterprises. So if we're thinking about a geoeconomic strategy, again, I would probably look at Canada's pillars as being, again, that energy provider, a critical mineral provider, but also part of the rule-setting process to ensure that those 21st century trade agreements are creating synergy and creating the conditions for Canada to be at the forefront of research and development and shaping the way we think about trade and environmental labor law and how much states should be involved in the economy. And I think that's a really, really important way to think about Canada's geoeconomic engagement.
So what exactly are Canada's interests in the Indo-Pacific region when it invests significant resources like what you described? It may sound a little too self-serving to say ask what it's looking to get back in return, but what does Canada see coming back the other way in terms of benefits to its national security, to its economy, to what have you?
Well, I think it's the reality is the Indo-Pacific region, and let's frame that Indo-Pacific region from the Western Indian Ocean to through the Indian Ocean, through the South China Sea, through the Pacific. So it's connecting the huge North American and South American market. We shouldn't forget that.
Of course.
It's connecting that to the East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. This is the place of global growth. It has the largest growing population of middle-class consumers. This is so important, right? Because we sell stuff. I think that it is the place with the largest populated countries, India, followed by China, and Indonesia. These will all be centers, again, of consumption and potential opportunities for Canada. Now, aside from it being kind of the locus of global economic growth, I think it is a region of under-institutionalization or a paucity of institutions, requiring, I think, Canada to be part of the region, part of the rule setting that I mentioned earlier, so that we're at the table, not on the menu. So how do we lock Canada into the region? By being part of the rule setting processes. So I think that primarily is Canada's national interest, to make sure that we are embedded in the region, we're part of the rules setting processes, and we're not locked out of the region. Another area that I think is important that we don't talk about enough is the instability or potential instability in the region, whether that's traditional security issues such as territorial issues in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and Himalayan Plateau, whether it's the nuclear challenges on the Korean Peninsula, or the non-traditional security challenges that have impacted us all over the past 3 years in terms of COVID-19, right? It disrupted supply chains, it disrupted trade, it disrupted tourism. So I think Canada is looking at the region as a place where it needs to provide more resources to help deal with the traditional security challenges and the non-traditional security challenges, because they will spill over into Canada. And really a good example of this is what's happening across the Taiwan Straits. or Taiwan Strait, we think about Taiwan as, this semiconductor superpower. And that if there was friction, some kind of kinetic conflict across the Taiwan Straits, how would this affect these semiconductor supply chains? And I think, we're talking in Japan, Japan's signature industries would be devastated, whether it's Honda, Suzuki, Toyota, Sony, Hitachi, all are using these kinds of semiconductors in their products. It would devastate our airlines, our defense systems. And I think some Canadians might think, oh, we have nothing to do with this. But in reality, there's Toyota companies and factories in Canada, and they're making those cars, and they employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians. So from my standpoint, Canada has a deep vetted interest in being part of the region, providing stability, ensuring that these pressure points within the region don't actually turn into kinetic conflict and cause regional and global economic disruption.
So that touches on the idea of economic security, of course, but also supply chain security. You mentioned COVID and all the disruptions that came from that. You talked earlier about the role of critical minerals and how Canada can be a supplier of all of this. Can you talk a little bit about Canada's efforts to increase supply chain security in the region, sort of maybe specific initiatives that it's taking, what some vulnerabilities that Canada particularly may encounter?
So I think this is an evolving area. Last year we hosted Melanie Joly, who's our foreign minister here in Tokyo, and really resilient supply chains wasn't on the. It just wasn't. We weren't discussing it. But if you go back to the March Foreign Ministers G7 event that was held in Karizawa, of course, resilient supply chains became part of the discussion, and the G7 summit that came out of Hiroshima talked about resilient supply chains, and they had a whole extra document talking about economic cohesion and supply chains. So it seems that we're now on the same page of the book as the other G7 members and some of our critical partners in the region, such as Japan, such as South Korea, on the importance of strengthening supply chains, creating more resilience. I call it selectively diversifying. The new sexy term is de-risking, but I think in reality, it's selectively diversifying where our supply chains are going. And Canada sees itself as having a role in terms of providing those critical minerals that can be used in the electronics that, again, our partners like Japan, South Korea, and others are putting into these sophisticated technologies. So I think it is trying to position itself to be that critical mineral superpower, reliable, politically stable, a country of rules, transparency, and even if we have a change in power, political power, that our allies and partners don't have to worry about a major disruption in critical minerals. On the energy side, liquid natural gas is another area that I think Canada's thinking about and how they're able to export to the region. And they're working with the Japanese to try and find opportunities to export liquid natural gas to Japan. Japan has invested in Canada, has created some infrastructure in the west coast of Canada that should be online, I think, in 2024 to 2025, which would be an area where liquid natural gas can be processed and then exported to the region. So there's more can be done. Environmental politics back in Canada are tense, and I think there's a lot of division between at the political level and some of the provinces that really have all the resources, but they feel like the federal government isn't allowing them to get it out to markets. And this is difficult. The domestic politics in the country are, I think, making it more difficult for Canada as a country to realize its efforts. And what's interesting about this, Paul, is that what we're seeing is the provinces are starting to produce their own Indo-Pacific strategies.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so Quebec has one, Saskatchewan has one, and we're likely to see an Albertan one. These are the energy-rich provinces come out because they feel there's some disconnect between the national Indo-Pacific strategy and their regional needs. So I think in the coming year, you should not be surprised to see provincial approaches to the Indo-Pacific to try and get the energy resources out of the country to bypass some of the national level politics.
Oh, that would be a very interesting development. to sort of go from the provincial level to the geopolitical level, obviously one of the big hallmarks of the region today is the geopolitical competition. You can insert whichever adjective you prefer between the United States and China. Where does Canada fit into that? I mean, obviously Canada is an ally of the United States, longest undefended border in the world. But at the same time, China's, needless to say, an important economic partner, just as it is for everyone else in the region. And at the same time, we're seeing the economic architecture of the region shift and change and develop amongst that. Where does Canada step in on, not just the geopolitical competition, but also in terms of trying to proactively build an economic architecture that can accommodate two large economies who might not always see eye to eye?
So I think it's a useful place to start is to look at Canada's trade figures. So about 80% of its trade is within North America, and the NAFTA 2.0 agreement,
of course,
has only strengthened the supply chains within North America. And what we're seeing is the market become more integrated. And we benefit tremendously from that. So our primary interest continues to be investing in North America. Over the past 5 years, the relationship between China and Canada has worsened. With the arrest of the Huawei executive, Meng Wanzhou, back in 2018, and then the subsequent hostage diplomacy and the arrest of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavro, really created a negative spiral in our bilateral relations. And of course, we've had threats against Canadian politicians, Michael Chung, as well as, I think, some very solid evidence of interference in our political system. So China is, it's a radioactive topic. And I use that term a little bit sarcastically since the Fukushima disinformation about Fukushima treated water. But everything about China is radioactive right now, and I don't think we have a rational approach. If we look at the data, prairie provinces continue to increase their agricultural exports to China. They've benefited throughout the pandemic, throughout the very negative relations, and they continue to benefit from this relationship. We have huge numbers of Chinese tourists coming to Canada. Again, we benefit from it. They go to our education institutions. So it's a paradox, and I think here Japan and Canada share many paradoxes when it comes to the relationship. Is that Japan enjoys a $391 billion trade relationship with China. It's largely equal. There are severe security challenges, but at the economic level, there's so many complementarities. And I think we see the same in Canada. So how do we continue to have these benefits while at the same time be realistic that the current domestic trajectory of China and some of its economic coercion practices aren't targeted at Canada the way they were targeted at Australia or South Korea or Japan? And I don't think we have the political space at this stage to do something to craft a nuanced policy, although I know there is discussions on this. How far do we align with the United States? The United States is our biggest trade partner. We have many shared cultural, political, and social institutions, and of course, our mutual love of hockey, but also your interest in hockey. So I think that we have to continue to craft a policy to deal with the changing economic architecture within the region that complements our closest partners like the United States and Japan, while at the same time has a distinct Canadian brand that tries to weave a less politicized, less securitized approach with China. And the reason why I say that is that Canada is a middle power country. We don't have the resources that Japan has or the United States has. And we can be a casualty very easily if we don't make wise choices. And the arrest of Michael Spavro and Michael Kovrig was a good example of that. So we need more nuance in our policy. I'm a big advocate of looking at how Japan is managing the relationship because they've even though there's many problems, they continue to deepen their economic relationship and find ways to solve problems. I think more of that's going to be necessary to, again, deal with the changing economic architecture and the inevitable boomerang effects that will come from intensification of the US-China strategic rivalry.
In turning to another one of Canada's partners in the Indo-Pacific region, recently there's been a big, not sure what to call it exactly, diplomatic blow-up between your country and India. Can you explain what that's about?
Well, it appears that a Canadian citizen who's a Sikh and also an advocate of a separatist policy of a supposed state called Khalistan, apparently he was killed and assassinated in June 2023. According to the media and according to Prime Minister Trudeau's comments, the security services seem to have identified that the Indian government may have been part of this. So this is a killing in a foreign country by a foreign state. This is the kind of things that we're accustomed with Russia doing, right?
Yeah.
But we're not accustomed to India doing this. So I don't know the details in terms of the intelligence. So I hesitate to say if this is state-sponsored assassination or not. But
the diplomatic fallout seems fairly significant.
It's serious. Canada put India in its Indo-Pacific strategy. It wanted to diversify and strengthen its economic partnership with India as part of its geoeconomic engagement. It wanted to sign an FTA, free trade agreement, at the end of the year with India. It's tried to enhance the movement of Indian highly skilled migrants to Canada. And the backlash from this, but also a series of I think, faux pas and taboos by the Canadian government in India over the past 5 or 6 years have culminated in, I think, a real souring of bilateral relations. And the real concern about this is that if you're wanting to engage in the Indo-Pacific region, it can't just be Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. You have to have an Indian component. Because India, again, it plays such an important geographic position, but it's a rising power, it's a rising economy. It will be part of shaping the norms of the region. And if we don't have a working relationship with India, this will create challenges in terms of a sustained, meaningful foreign policy in the region. And this will, it is so important for any country engaging in the region to be taken seriously, is that, again, they have to have a long-term, sustainable, realistic, pragmatic, engaged policy within the region that's nuanced.
So I guess this is what you're getting at when you're talking about the difficulty in balancing all of these different competing things. Is that fair to say?
So no country does it well.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's very difficult. I think the Indo-Pacific region is very heterogeneous. We have socialist states like Vietnam, authoritarian states like China. We have democracies. We have many different kinds of states. So if you want to engage in the region, you have to, I think, have a more interest-based approach to the region and build your geoeconomic, your economic security policy based on those this interest-based approach. And this contrasts with a value-based approach, right? You can value human rights and democracy and diversity at home, but maybe these aren't the best pillars to engage in the region when the region doesn't really value these as they think about trade agreements, as they think about infrastructure and connectivity, as they think about new digital infrastructure and new digital rules. Or you think about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework again, it's not talking about values. It's talking about interests and development and the environment. And these are the priorities here. And I think Canada is going to need to think more carefully about how to approach this region to be effective.
Let's talk about IPEF for a little bit. Because the sense that I get, in talking to people here and around the region is that it's, very obviously a next best alternative to CPTPP. But it's also the best you're probably going to get from the Biden administration, And in terms of, the negotiations for all that, it sounds like everyone is taking it seriously, negotiating in good faith. There does seem to be some progress, but it's obviously got a much lower ceiling in terms of economic benefits. I mean, I'm sort of editorializing here. It seems to have a much lower ceiling in terms of what you can gain economically than you could with a more permanent free trade agreement. And how would you describe Canada's approach to IPEF? Is this something that they're along with for the ride? Do they see this as something that can build up towards something more enduring? What's the take here?
They've come around to the table of the importance of IPEF, but with the initial discussions, Canada's not part of the initial rounds of the discussion. So I'm part of a research group based in Singapore at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, in a big project that's funded by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation here in Tokyo. We put together a series of policy briefs looking at different countries' positions. Canada's not part of it. I did the Japanese side. Our general take is that this is an inclusive agreement. It's not a trade agreement. It's meant to create some shared norms and a trajectory of how the region is going to move towards building institutions that have some shared interests and shared norms about, let's say, the environment. Let's say about the digital economy. Let's say we're talking about
trade facilitation.
Rather than market access.
Yeah.
And I think that we collectively as a group are saying this is not necessarily bad. It may be a better approach for a heterogeneous region that is allergic to binding relationships. And if they can create shared norms and shared behavior, that'll be enough to deepen.
You're still moving the ball forward, I guess.
Still moving the balls forward. The reality is the United States is not coming back to the TPP. I don't think the TPP is going to eventually include China because state-owned enterprises in the direction of China right now. So the limits of what we can think about in terms of creating an economic architecture within the region will be based on, I think, what the IPEF is providing. I think it's interesting because it's a la carte, meaning that if you're Vietnam, you don't have to take all the 4 pillars. You can take what you want. And this may be, again, the best approach to deal with a heterogeneous region.
Interesting.
And I think countries like Japan and South Korea, they're very comfortable with this. Of course, they would like a hard trade agreement, but they're very comfortable with this kind of approach because it brings in more partners. And that's what they're looking for, more partners, building shared norms, building shared institutions. And it seems that's the direction of IPEF. In January, they're going to complete the first round. And after that, I think Canada will come to the table and join the second round of the negotiations. And I think that this will, again, become another layer of Canada's geoeconomic engagement with the Indo-Pacific region. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes. And the commitment of the government and how well they'll be able to play with some of the heterogeneous members in the region.
Interesting. Well, Dr. Stephen Nagy, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope we can revisit these topics again in the future.
Thanks, Paul. It's great. Much appreciated.
Not at all. This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Finally, China's influence in North America is well known and goes back hundreds of years, and some listeners might also be familiar with Peru's famous lomo saltado, a stir-fried beef dish with origins in Peru's Chinese population who migrated to South America to work as laborers in the 1800s. But China's influence in Latin America goes back even farther than that. Writing in America's Quarterly, Peter Gordon and Juan Jose Morales described the trade route between Manila in the Philippines and Acapulco, Mexico, that enabled the world's first truly global trade route, with goods from Asia passing through the Americas on their way to Europe. Sailing west from Mexico to Asia was fairly straightforward, given the prevailing winds and currents along the equator provided a fairly direct voyage that sailors had been using for years. But explorers realized that by sailing far enough to the north, as far as the 38th parallel, they could take advantage of the westerly winds blowing towards California and make the return voyage to Mexico. This even led the Spanish to found way stations in what would eventually become Monterrey and San Diego that were founded to resupply the merchant ships coming back from Asia on their way to Acapulco in Mexico. Of course, people eventually made the trip as well, with merchants and workers from China and the Philippines settling in Mexico City. An Asian market could be found in the Plaza Mayor, selling spices, porcelain, jewels, and fabrics from all over Asia. It wasn't just luxury goods that could be found either, but there were also mass market goods for the general public, like furniture, clothing, and linens. Gordon and Morales also describe how Chinese manufacturers would even design products specifically for the Mexican market, using porcelain to manufacture the traditional Mexican gourds for drinking chocolate. The Spanish paid for these goods with Mexican silver, which was in higher demand in China than European gold because of its purity and weight, and because China had few domestic sources of this critical mineral itself. Minters in Mexico made these coins round and with raised and serrated edges to prevent merchants from, quote-unquote, clipping the edges as a way of fraud and to help guarantee the coin's value. Gordon and Morales write that these coins formed the basis of China's coinage in the 18th century, with China naming the currency after its round shape, the yuan, or, as is known in Japan, the yen. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to know what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for the show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.